December 23rd, 1944, deep inside the Ardennes forest. Snow fell in heavy sheets, muffling every sound until even the war itself seemed to hold its breath. The wind dragged thin ribbons of fog through the trees, twisting them around trunks blackened by smoke. Somewhere beneath that white silence, a small American patrol moved like shadows, 7 figures swallowed by a storm that erased both map and memory. They were supposed to have reached Bastogne by dawn. Instead, the blizzard had turned the world into a blur of white walls and ghost roads. Their boots sank deep into drifts that reached their knees. Every breath turned to ice in their scarves. The compass, the only thing standing between direction and death, hung from Sergeant Miller's neck, its glass cracked, its needle quivering uncertainly as if caught between 2 truths. Miller checked it again, though he already knew the truth. The needle didn't move anymore. Frost had claimed it hours ago, freezing it in place, pointing east when they needed north. But his men didn't know that. He snapped the lid shut, tucked it beneath his coat, and said only, "Keep moving. North by east." His voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that made younger soldiers believe the world was still under control. Private Jenkins, the youngest of the group, stumbled through the snow behind him. "Sir, you sure this is the right way?" Miller didn't answer right away. He stared ahead into the void, watching the flakes tilt in the wind, noting which way they drifted, how the treetops leaned. "It's the only way we've got," he finally said. The forest gave nothing back, no roads, no stars, no sound but the endless hiss of falling snow. Behind them, Corporal Davis adjusted his rifle strap and muttered, "If the Krauts don't get us, the cold will." No one laughed. Hours stretched like days. The sun was just a faint blur behind the clouds, a dull grey glow that offered no warmth and no direction. The storm thickened until visibility fell to a few feet. They stopped every 20 minutes to knock ice off their weapons, hands shaking even inside thick gloves. Somewhere to the west, artillery thundered, distant but steady, a reminder that the front was still out there, somewhere beyond this frozen maze. Miller paused near a fallen pine. The trunk lay half buried in snow, its exposed roots clawing upward like frozen fingers. He crouched and scraped at the ground with his glove, revealing a faint line of wheel tracks. German supply vehicles, maybe a day old. They ran perpendicular to the direction they were walking. He studied them for a long moment, tracing the pattern, the way the snow had settled into the grooves. They were headed south, he whispered to himself. Then we're close to the ridge. He didn't tell the others what he'd found. Confidence was a currency, and he was running low. The men needed certainty more than truth. Private Ellison coughed, voice raw from the cold. "We've been walking for hours, Sarge. We're going in circles." Miller stood dusting the frost from his knees. "Then we'll circle right into Bastogne if we keep at it." The men followed, heads down, eyes half closed against the wind. As night began to bleed through the sky, the forest darkened. Snow turned blue, then grey, then nearly black. Miller called a halt near a cluster of firs where the snow thinned. They dug shallow trenches, not for fighting but for warmth, and huddled close, sharing what little rations they had left. 2 chocolate bars, 3 cigarettes, a single canteen half-frozen solid. The men talked in low voices. Some cursed the storm, others prayed. Miller sat apart, compass in his hand, thumb brushing over the cracked glass. He held it close to his ear, listening as if it might whisper something back. Nothing, just the soft rattle of the loose needle. He thought of the training manual that said, "When lost, trust your instruments." But the manual had never stood in the Ardennes in a whiteout, with the air so cold it froze the sweat on your eyelids. The manual didn't know that sometimes the instruments lied, and all that remained was instinct. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl screeched. The men froze, fingers tightening on triggers. Then silence again. Miller's gaze drifted upward. Through a break in the clouds, he saw a faint glow, the reflection of firelight, maybe from burning fuel trucks far away, or maybe from Bastogne itself. He couldn't tell. But he remembered something his father used to say back in Ohio, on winter nights when the wind howled through the barns. If you can see the glow, you're closer to home than you think. He didn't believe in signs, but tonight he needed one. The storm shifted just before midnight. The wind died, and for the first time in hours he could hear the snow falling softly, individual flakes landing with almost no sound at all. It was beautiful and terrifying, because in that silence the world felt too still, too empty, the kind of quiet that made you think something was watching. Miller rose, stamping the cold from his boots. "On your feet," he said quietly. "We move before we freeze." "Which way?" Jenkins asked. Miller looked down at the compass again. The needle, frozen in its lie, still pointed east. He turned north instead. "This way." No one argued. They trusted him. Maybe that trust was their only real weapon left. They moved single file, ghosts in the snow, rifles slung low, breath vanishing into the mist. The forest seemed endless, but somewhere ahead, hidden in the dark, the sergeant knew there had to be a way out. He didn't know how he knew. He just did. Behind him, the last man in line looked back, half expecting to see light German patrols, maybe, or salvation. But there was nothing, only the blizzard swallowing their tracks as fast as they made them. And still they walked, because sometimes faith doesn't point north. It just keeps you moving. Dawn came slow, dim and grey, if it could be called dawn at all. The Ardennes had no horizon that morning, only a thin fog pressing down like the lid of a coffin. The men stirred in silence, brushing frost from their sleeves and stamping their numb feet. Their breath clouded the air like smoke. Somewhere deep in the woods, artillery muttered again, far but close enough to remind them that the world beyond the snow was still on fire. Sergeant Miller stood apart, his back against a pine, watching his men wake. 7 of them, faces pale, eyes hollow, each carrying the same question he refused to answer. How far to Bastogne? He didn't know any more. The compass, cracked and useless, hung from his neck like a secret he couldn't afford to share. Every time he touched it, he felt the weight of it pulling him down. He'd led men before, in Italy and across the hedgerows of Normandy. But leadership there had been simple. Maps, orders, coordinates, air cover. This was different. The forest swallowed logic. The storm erased every trace of the world. There was no up, no down, no road, just trust. And that, he realised, was more fragile than glass. Private Jenkins approached with a canteen, frost clinging to his eyebrows. "Coffee's gone, sir. All we got is snow." Miller managed a faint smile. "Snow'll do." He took a handful and rubbed it across his face, the cold stinging him awake. The men gathered their gear without speaking. When Miller pointed toward the dim glow in the east, no one asked how he knew. They just fell in line. That was the thing about faith. It demanded movement, even when it made no sense. As they marched, the forest grew denser. Pine trunks rose like pillars in a cathedral, each coated with a thin crust of ice. The path narrowed until they moved in single file, their boots crunching softly on the crusted snow. Every few minutes someone coughed or cursed, the sound quickly swallowed by the wind. Miller kept glancing upward, reading the direction of smoke drifting between branches. Somewhere, maybe miles away, fires burned fuel depots, wrecks, who could tell? But he followed them anyway. He had once learned to navigate by the wind alone on fishing trips with his father along Lake Erie. "If you can smell the smoke," his father used to say, "you're walking toward people." It wasn't army training, but it was all he had left. Hours passed. The blizzard weakened, but the cold only deepened. One man slipped and didn't rise right away. Miller turned, grabbed him by the collar, and lifted him to his feet. "Not here," he said quietly. "We rest when we're safe." Corporal Davis, older and more worn, muttered from the back, "Safe? There's no safe out here. You're chasing ghosts, Sarge." Miller didn't answer. Command wasn't a debate. It was momentum, and momentum was survival. He pressed forward, scanning the trees for signs of life. He found none, only silence and the faint echo of wind moaning through branches. By midday, the men stopped to rest near a frozen creek. They gathered around a small dent in the ground where Miller crouched, scraping away snow to expose the thin layer of ice beneath. "This is it," he said softly. "If we follow it, it should lead downhill. Creeks always run toward valleys, and valleys mean roads." The men stared, uncertain. Private Ellison frowned. "You sure about that, Sarge?" He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell them that he hadn't seen a landmark in 12 hours, that the compass was a lie, and his sense of direction hung by a thread. But what came out was, "I'm sure enough." They followed the frozen stream. The wind shifted again, blowing against their faces. Miller noticed the direction change immediately. West to east, good. They were heading south after all. Every small sign mattered now. He checked the compass once more. The needle still pointed east, defiant in its uselessness. He closed it and shoved it back inside his coat, pretending it still guided him. The weight of leadership pressed on him like the cold, silent, constant, unforgiving. His men didn't need truth. They needed a heartbeat to follow. And if that meant lying, then he would lie. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade again. The forest turned silver, then steel grey. Snow flurries hissed against helmets. Miller caught himself counting their footsteps just to stay focused. 300, 500, 700. Beyond that, numbers lost meaning. The forest repeated itself endlessly, every tree a mirror of the last. He thought of home again, of fields and fences buried under clean Ohio snow. He could almost hear his father's voice. "Don't let the needle do the thinking. Feel the pull beneath your ribs that's north." He looked up. The sky had broken open just enough for a sliver of light to escape. The sun pale, ghost-like hung low to the left. South. He adjusted their path slightly, tilting them toward it. It wasn't much, but it was something. As darkness crept back over the woods, they stumbled upon a broken wagon half buried in snow German markings, bullet holes along the side. Inside, frozen rations and an oil lamp half full. Miller struck a match. The flame flickered weakly, then steadied. For the first time in 2 days, warmth returned, even if only for a moment. Jenkins looked at the compass in Miller's hand and frowned. "Sir, that thing's cracked, isn't it?" Miller hesitated. Then he smiled faintly and said, "Doesn't matter. It's been pointing the right way all along." He pocketed it again before anyone could look closer. Sometimes a leader's burden isn't knowing the way. It's pretending he does. Outside, the storm began to rise once more. The wind screamed through the trees, and the fire inside the wagon guttered. Miller stood, tightened his coat, and whispered just loud enough for himself to hear, North by east, until someone proves me wrong." Then he opened the door, and the patrol stepped back into the white. By the third night, even the forest seemed to have turned against them. The trees no longer offered cover. They were prison bars made of ice and bark. The wind that once carried their breath away now screamed through the branches like a warning. Every sound, the creak of snow, the snap of frozen twigs, echoed too loudly. The men had stopped talking. When voices fell silent, thoughts grew louder. Sergeant Miller could feel the change before anyone spoke it aloud. Trust was thinning, like a rope frayed from too much strain. Every step now came with questions that no one dared ask. How long had they been lost? Were they even heading north anymore? Private Ellison was the first to break. His whisper sliced through the quiet. "Sarge, I think we've passed this ridge before." Miller turned. His expression didn't change. "You think trees move when we're not looking?" The men chuckled weakly, but the sound died almost instantly. There was no humour left in them, only exhaustion. The storm had gnawed at their nerves until even laughter felt like betrayal. They pressed forward, weaving through the pines. The snow had crusted over into sharp ridges that cracked underfoot. Jenkins limped, his left boot torn near the heel, and every few yards he stumbled. Miller slowed his pace so the boy could keep up, though he said nothing. Mercy in war was best shown quietly. Behind them, Davis muttered again. "We're going in circles. I swear I saw that fallen log yesterday." Miller stopped, turned, and stared him down. Then maybe yesterday was the right direction. The look in his eyes wasn't anger, it was survival dressed as command. He couldn't let doubt bloom. Doubt spread faster than frostbite. They resumed walking, heads low, breaths shallow. Somewhere above, the clouds parted for a heartbeat, revealing a thin ribbon of moonlight. It gleamed off Miller's helmet, off the cracked compass swinging against his chest. He caught it in his palm before anyone noticed, pressed it tight, and whispered under his breath, "Just keep lying the right way." An hour later, the forest opened into a shallow clearing. Broken branches and tracks scarred the snow-fresh, human and heavy. The men froze. Miller crouched, tracing one with his glove. "German patrol," he said quietly. "Maybe a dozen men, moving southwest." Private Jenkins swallowed hard. That's toward us." Miller nodded. "Which means we're close to their flank." Ellison shook his head. "Or surrounded." He didn't answer. Both could be true. They slipped into the tree line, ducking low, weapons ready though their hands shook from cold. Every step felt stolen. The snow muffled their boots, but the sound of their hearts felt deafening. The forest glowed faintly with reflected light from somewhere beyond a campfire maybe, or burning wreckage still smouldering from yesterday's shelling. Then came the scent wood smoke, faint but real. It drifted through the trees, soft and warm like a promise. "Americans?" Jenkins whispered. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Or bait." They waited. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. The wind shifted, carrying the smell stronger now, mixed with diesel and something else bred. That small detail broke the silence like gunfire. Real food, real warmth. Davis stepped forward, rifle raised halfway. "Sarge, if that's one of ours—" "If it's one of ours, we'll know soon enough," Miller interrupted. His voice was steady, but his pulse wasn't. He knew traps. He'd seen them in Italy fake fires, abandoned helmets, the illusion of safety waiting to pull men into a kill zone. He motioned them down. "We stay low, 2 at a time, slow crawl." They obeyed, fear and faith pulling them in equal measure. The closer they got, the clearer the light became. A single flame flickering beside a shattered supply truck half buried in snow. No voices, no movement. Just the slow crackle of burning wood and the groan of metal in the cold. Miller motioned for Davis to cover him. He crept forward, inch by inch, until he could see inside. 3 bodies lay frozen near the fire, German uniforms stiff with frost. Abandoned rifles half covered in snow. One of them still clutched a loaf of bread, frozen mid-bite. He exhaled slowly. "They froze before the fire died," he muttered. Behind him Jenkins whispered, "Then why's it still burning?" Miller looked closer. The fire wasn't wood, it was fuel. A leaking canister under the wreck was feeding a thin blue flame. It hissed like a living thing. One spark wrong, and it would erupt. He motioned his men back. "Move!" They scrambled just as the flame roared up, licking the sky. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough to send shards of metal and flame across the snow. The men dove behind trees. The blast echoed, rolling through the forest like thunder. When the sound faded, Miller rose slowly, brushing soot from his coat. The light from the burning wreck painted his face in orange flickers. "That's your answer," he said flatly. "East is death. We keep west." No one argued now. The fire behind them burned bright and ugly, a false hope undone. They walked again, each man wrapped in his own silence. Hours later, the forest swallowed them once more. Only then did Miller glance down at the compass. The glass had shattered completely in the blast. The needle was gone. All that remained was the empty face, reflecting the faint glow of the fire behind them. He smiled bitterly, closing it tight. "Guess it finally stopped lying," he murmured. The men didn't hear him. They trudged on, following his footsteps without question. But in the sergeant's chest, something cold began to shift. A whisper of fear he dared not name. Because if faith was all they had left, he wasn't sure how much of it still belonged to him. The forest gave no answers. Only wind. Only white. The night bled into morning without sunrise. The forest was dim, endless, a corridor of ash and ice. The men had stopped counting days. Time didn't matter when every hour felt the same. Hunger gnawed quietly, but fear had a louder voice. And still, Sergeant Miller led them, each step a small act of rebellion against the cold, against doubt, against the war itself. He no longer checked the compass. There was nothing left to check. The cracked lid hung against his chest, like a medal for a battle he hadn't won. What guided him now wasn't direction. It was instinct, that quiet pulse in his ribs that had never failed him on the farm, in the dark, in the fields before dawn. He walked not by sight, but by the rhythm of the wind. It whispered to him now, faint and uneven. It came from the west, carrying with it something he hadn't felt in days. Warmth. Not much, just the barest trace of it, as if the air itself remembered sunlight. He followed it, one boot after another, saying nothing. Behind him Jenkins stumbled and fell to one knee. His rifle dropped, clattering against the frozen ground. "I can't, Sarge," he breathed. "I can't feel my feet." Miller crouched, gripping the young man's shoulders. His hands were shaking too, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "You feel that wind?" he asked. Jenkins nodded weakly. "Then stand. It's leading us home." The boy didn't believe it, but he stood. That was enough. They pushed through a cluster of pines so thick the branches tore at their coats. Beyond it lay a narrow slope descending into fog. Miller paused at the edge, scanning the terrain. The ground here was uneven, the snow marked with faint lines. No, not lines, impressions. Shallow, rhythmic, deliberate. He knelt, brushing snow away until the shape became clear. Mines, dozens of them. German S-mines, half buried but still deadly. "Hold," he whispered. His voice barely carried, yet the men froze instantly. The air felt heavier now. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. Davis leaned forward. "We can't go around. Maybe there's another way." Miller shook his head. "The ridge runs both sides. It's this or backtrack into enemy lines." Silence. Then Jenkins whispered, "So what do we do?" Miller stared across the clearing. It stretched only 50 yards, maybe less. Beyond it, the fog thickened but glowed faintly, the light of flares, or maybe the first break of morning. He closed his eyes and listened. Faint, distant booms rolled through the air, American artillery, the rhythm of home. He counted the intervals between impacts. 8 seconds apart, maybe 10. South by southwest. He opened his eyes. "We follow the sound," he said. Davis frowned. "Through a minefield?" Miller nodded once. Through a minefield. There was no argument left in any of them. Words had lost their worth. The men lined up behind him, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Miller drew a line in the snow with the butt of his rifle. Step where I step. Nothing else. Not a foot to the side. The first step sank deep. The snow hissed softly as it compacted. Nothing. The second, another whisper of movement. Still nothing. He exhaled, slow and steady, and took a third. Each pace was deliberate, each pause a lifetime. The men followed, matching his stride perfectly. Jenkins was second, Davis behind him, then the others. 7 shadows moving through white silence. No one spoke, even the forest seemed to listen. Halfway through, Miller felt it, a faint vibration beneath his boot, like a tremor. He froze. The air turned sharp. He didn't breathe, neither did anyone else. Seconds passed, long, impossible seconds. The vibration faded. He shifted his weight back, gently, slowly, until the pressure released. "Keep moving," he whispered. The last 20 yards felt endless. Each step was another chance for death to choose a name. Miller kept his eyes on the horizon, never the ground. Focus on distance, not danger. That was how you survived. When his boots finally touched the other side, he turned and watched each man cross. One by one they made it until Jenkins. The boy's foot slipped. Snow gave way. A hollow click cracked the air. Time fractured. Miller lunged without thought, slamming into Jenkins and dragging him forward. The explosion tore through the snow behind them, throwing a fountain of whitened earth into the sky. Shrapnel hissed past like hornets. Miller hit the ground hard, his ears ringing. The boy's voice was a distant echo. "Sarge!" He rolled over, breath gone, snow falling on his face. Smoke rose from a crater 10 feet behind them. No one else was hit. They were alive. Barely. Jenkins crawled closer, shaking. "You saved me." Miller didn't answer. He looked at the minefield scarred, smoking, silent again. "No," he said softly. "We got lucky." They lay there for a long time, breathing the taste of burnt soil and fear. When the ringing faded, Miller heard it again. The distant thunder of artillery, steady and sure. He smiled faintly. "That's south," he whispered. "That's where we're going." He rose to his feet, pulled the boy up beside him, and faced the fog ahead. Every direction looked the same, but he no longer cared. He didn't need a compass. The earth itself was pointing the way. Behind him, the others stood too silent, watchful, waiting for his signal. Miller raised his hand and motioned forward. "One line, don't stop." The wind picked up again, carrying smoke and faint echoes of gunfire. He followed it, step by step, eyes fixed on the pale light beyond the mist. For the first time, he wasn't leading by guesswork. He was following something older, quieter, the instinct that lives where reason breaks. The compass had died, but the man hadn't, and sometimes that was enough. The wind died sometime after midnight, leaving the forest too still, too fragile, as if one sound might shatter it. The men moved slower now, not from caution but exhaustion. Their bodies had become machines of habit step, breathe, watch, repeat. The cold had eaten the colour from their faces, their lips were cracked, their fingers numb even beneath wool and leather. Yet they followed the same shadow in front of them, the same steady rhythm of boots that never faltered. Sergeant Miller. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Fatigue had carved dark lines under his eyes, but his focus never wavered. Each sound mattered, the creak of a tree bending in the wind, the distant pop of gunfire, the way snow hissed when it fell on metal. The world had become an equation of small noises, each one a clue. They reached a ridge overlooking a vast hollow drowned in fog. In the dim half-light, Miller saw the faint outlines of barbed wire and wooden posts half buried in snow. German positions, abandoned or manned, it was impossible to tell. Somewhere in that mist lay either salvation or another dead end. He crouched low, scanning the slope below. The terrain funneled down into a frozen meadow. A narrow path wound through it, almost invisible except for a faint trail of broken snow. "We cross there," he said quietly. Davis frowned. "You sure that's safe?" Miller didn't look at him. "Nothing's safe, but that's the way." They began the descent. The slope was slick, every step a risk. At the bottom the fog thickened and the world shrank to a radius of 10 feet. Miller could hear his heartbeat, steady and slow, counting seconds in the silence. Then a sound, distant but distinct, the rhythmic bark of machine gun fire, faint and muffled. German MG-42s. He froze. The others halted behind him, their eyes wide. "Close?" Jenkins whispered. Miller listened again, head tilted. The echo came faint, bouncing between ridges. "No," he said softly. "That's miles off, maybe more." But the tone of his voice carried doubt. They crouched among the snow-covered shrubs, waiting for the bursts to fade. In that pause, the forest seemed alive again, branches shifting, faint creaks, the soft groan of wood. It was hard to tell what was real and what was imagination born of fatigue. Miller pressed his hand against the frozen earth. He felt nothing but the deep pulse of the ground steady, dull, like the distant beat of artillery. He closed his eyes and listened harder. Each thud rolled through the soil in a pattern, consistent, reliable. American guns. The sound came from the southwest. He opened his eyes. "That's our line," he murmured. "Artillery from Bastogne, less than 5 miles." The words fell like fire into the cold. The men straightened, hope flickering for the first time in days. Jenkins grinned weakly. 5 miles. We can do 5 miles. Miller nodded, but his gaze never softened. Hope was dangerous. It made men rush, made them careless. He studied the meadow ahead again. Something about it was wrong. The snow looked uneven, rippled. He moved forward slowly, prodding the ground with his rifle barrel. A soft metallic click answered him. He froze. Then he saw it half-buried mines, again, this time laid in a perfect pattern across the field. Beyond them, the faint silhouette of wooden poles tripwires. The Germans had prepared this ground well. He stepped back, whispering sharply, "Minefield. Stay low." Davis cursed under his breath. "We can't go around." Miller shook his head. "We'd lose direction. We follow the edge slow." They skirted the field, crawling on hands and knees. Frost bit through their gloves. The world had shrunk to the sound of breathing and the crunch of snow. Once Jenkins slipped, grabbing a wire, and Miller's hand shot out, catching him before the tension pulled. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Half an hour later, they cleared the last tripwire. Miller rose to his knees, scanning the horizon. A faint glow touched the treetop's dawn, pale and uncertain. He exhaled slowly. The light was weak, but it was something to chase. "On your feet," he whispered. "We're close." They followed the narrow valley, moving west again. The terrain levelled, the snow thinner now, broken by patches of frozen mud. Ahead, the air shimmered with smoke and the faint scent of gunpowder proof of life, of battle, of home. But the enemy hadn't vanished. From somewhere unseen came the low murmur of voices, German, too close. Miller raised a hand, signalling stop. The men dropped flat, barely breathing. Shadows moved in the fog, 4 figures, maybe 5, rifles slung across their shoulders. A patrol, walking parallel to them. Miller's pulse slowed deliberately. He waited until the soldiers disappeared behind the next ridge before motioning forward. The men rose, soundless. They crept along the edge of the valley until the whisper of German speech faded completely. Only then did they quicken their pace, stumbling through shallow drifts until the forest thinned. The first orange light of dawn filtered through the fog. Jenkins broke into a half-run, tears freezing on his cheeks. "We're out," he gasped. "Not yet," Miller said quietly. He pointed to a faint line in the snow ahead, boot prints, hundreds of them. American tread. They'd found a friendly trail. The men gathered around him, breath steaming in the cold. They stared at the prints like they were holy. Davis laughed weakly. "You did it, Sarge. You actually did it." Miller looked down at his boots, then at the frozen compass hanging from his neck. The glass was gone, the needle missing, only the metal casing left to reflect the light of dawn. He tucked it away, voice low. "No," he said, "we just stopped being lost." Behind him the forest began to fade in the rising sun, the white glare burning away the fog. The men stood still for a long time, letting the warmth reach them. But Miller didn't stop walking. He moved ahead, quiet, steady, the first footprints in a new trail. They followed, because sometimes faith doesn't shout orders. It just keeps walking through the dark until morning finally answers. The sun finally rose over the Ardennes, pale and colourless, spilling weak light across the endless white. It wasn't warmth, it was just illumination, a reminder that they'd survived another night. The forest behind them glowed faintly through the fog, its silence no longer menacing but reverent, like it too understood what they had endured. The men walked slower now, not from fear but disbelief. Every step forward felt like walking out of a dream they weren't sure had been real. The snow beneath their boots turned softer, the air less sharp. Somewhere far ahead, faint and fragile, came a sound that froze them in place. The deep mechanical growl of engines. Not German, American. Miller raised a hand, motioning for silence. They crouched low among the drifts, peering through the haze. Shapes moved beyond the fog tanks, trucks, soldiers wrapped in the familiar patchwork of olive drab. The 101st? Bastogne. For a long moment no one spoke. It was Jenkins who broke the silence, his voice a cracked whisper. "We made it." Miller didn't answer. He just stared, unable to process it. His knees felt weak, his breath shaking. The wind shifted, and the smell of diesel and coffee drifted toward them, the scent of life. He motioned them forward. "Move slow," he said quietly. "Don't startle them." They descended the last ridge together, 7 shadows stepping out of the forest. The nearest sentry spotted them first. "Identify yourselves," a voice barked. Miller raised both hands, his rifle slung across his shoulder. "Sergeant Miller, 3rd Platoon, 327th Infantry, Lost Patrol." The guard waved them closer, disbelief written on his face. "Lost? Sir, you came in from the east. That's German-held territory." Miller looked over his shoulder at the forest. "Not anymore," he said softly. The men stumbled into camp like ghosts returning from the grave. Medics swarmed them, wrapping blankets, handing tin cups of coffee. Jenkins drank so fast he coughed, tears freezing on his face. Davis laughed until his voice cracked. The sound didn't carry far, but it was real. Miller stood apart from them, hands buried in his coat pockets, staring toward the trees. He felt nothing at first, no pride, no victory, just a strange, heavy quiet. A medic approached, clipboard in hand. "You all right, Sergeant?" He nodded slowly. "Just tired." The man hesitated. "They said you came out of the woods without a compass." Miller reached into his pocket and pulled it out. The casing was warped, the glass gone, the inside a hollow shell. "Had one," he said. "Didn't do much good." The medic smiled faintly. "Still got you home, though." Miller turned the compass over in his palm, feeling its cold metal weight. "No," he murmured. "It just stopped lying long enough for me to listen." The medic frowned, unsure what that meant, but Miller didn't explain. Some truths belonged only to silence. Later, when the debriefing came, he told the officers what they needed to hear about the storm, the lost map, the frozen nights. He omitted the part where faith had replaced logic, where instinct had taken the wheel. War didn't have space for miracles, it only counted results. By evening, the men were asleep in real beds for the first time in days. The sound of distant artillery still echoed, but softer now, muffled by walls and exhaustion. Miller sat by the tent flap, staring at the frost melting on the fabric, the small drips tracing paths like rivers. The world was still cold, still cruel, but for the first time he felt warmth beneath it. He opened the compass again. Inside, where the needle had once been, a single shard of broken glass clung to the hinge. It caught the lantern light and reflected it, scattering tiny sparks across his hand. He smiled. "Guess you're still pointing somewhere," he said quietly. Outside, Jenkins stirred in his sleep. "Sarge?" Miller looked over. "Yeah?" The boy's voice was drowsy. "When you said we were heading north, were we?" "Loiter." Miller thought for a moment, then glanced toward the horizon where the faint orange glow of morning touched the clouds. "Not even close," he said with a tired grin. "But we got there anyway." Jenkins mumbled something like a laugh before drifting back to sleep. Miller closed the compass and set it beside his cot. He leaned back, eyes closing, his mind tracing the memory of the storm, the wind, the silence, the frozen trees, and the strange certainty that had guided him when reason had failed. He didn't know what to call it. Luck, instinct, grace. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it had worked. Outside the tent, dawn had fully broken. Snow melted from the branches, falling in soft, steady drops that sounded almost like applause. The forest, once an enemy, now seemed to breathe again, alive, forgiving. Sergeant Miller slept at last, the empty compass resting against his chest, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the ridges and the ruins, the artillery thundered one final time marking, not another battle, but the end of being lost. Because sometimes the truest guide isn't the instrument that points north. It's the voice inside that refuses to stop walking.